All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to moderate this panel with you guys. We have this incredible group of panelists who have been really wonderful thinkers and activists on this issue of gun violence and what we can do about it, so excited to hear from them. I also want to encourage you to store up your good questions for these panelists. We are going to have some time for questions at the end, and I'm looking forward to that. So I just want to set the stage. You know, gun violence in America, this is a huge public health crisis, almost any way that you can measure it. I did a story a few years ago where I was looking at how many people die from guns in other countries that we might consider to be our peer countries. So in the US, you're about as likely to die from a gun as you are from a car accident. In England, you're about as likely to die from a gun as you are to die from falling off a ladder. And in Japan, you're about as likely to die from a gun as being struck by lightning. So just, you know, not to make light of what is a really serious problem, but I do think it's important to have a sense of what the scale of our problem is and how different things are here and how much opportunity there is potentially to make it better. I think a lot of the discussion that we have about gun violence in America is focused on law enforcement, and it is focused on gun rights. And we have a big culture of gun rights. We have a Second Amendment to our Constitution. And I think those are frames for this debate that tend to be pretty politically divisive and sometimes feel like they're dead ends. So our panelists are really interested in thinking about this issue differently, thinking about it as more of a public health problem. So let's get down to it. You guys all have your programs, so I'm not going to give long introductions, but I want to just briefly introduce our panelists. So immediately to my left is Greg Jackson, who is the Deputy Director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the White House, a new office that hopefully he'll tell us about. And then we have Megan Ranney, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health at Yale, a professor of public health and also an emergency room physician. And all the way to my left is Michael Dowling, who's the president and CEO of Northwell Health, which is the largest healthcare provider in New York State. Let's just get started. And Megan, I was hoping you can kind of lead us off since you're the public health professor. What does it mean to have a public health approach to a problem like gun violence?
Thank you, Margot. It's a delight to be here with these great panelists and in this room back at Aspen Health Ideas. So a public health approach to gun violence or to any health problem is a couple of things that are different from the way that you described that we've normally approached gun violence. The first is that we focus on it as a health problem rather than as a criminal justice problem. We look at the physical harm, but also the emotional and social harm that happens to the person who's shot as well as to their community. So that's the first part, is just the way that we measure and talk about the problem is different. And then the second part of a public health approach is that we use a very standard scientific methodology to examine the problem, to identify factors that put someone at higher or lower risk of getting shot or having the after effects of gun violence. And then we develop interventions and test them. When we use that standard four-step approach, measure it, look at risk and protective factors, develop interventions and test them, and then scale up what works, it's unbelievably successful. We've applied it to problems ranging from lead poisoning to car crashes, which we've decreased car crash deaths by over 70%, despite there being millions more miles traveled per year than back in the 1970s. It's worked, of course, for COVID as well. Unfortunately, we've not applied that four-step public health approach to gun violence, much less defined it as a health problem, which has kept us stuck in that partisan divide that you've talked about.
Greg, can you tell us about who's affected by this? Like, what is the shape of this crisis? Who are the victims of gun violence?
Wow. Well, I mean, we know that the #1 cause of death from gun violence is suicide, and that disproportionately impacts veterans, farmers, and frankly, older white men in America. And that story is often overlooked and untold. When you look at the other side of the coin, about 46% or so of gun-related deaths are homicides. And that is where we see it more intensely impacting black and brown communities, primarily black males. But what we're also seeing is a huge spike in suicides of young black youth across the country and just youth of color in general. And I think the last big thing to just share is that this is the #1 cause of death for all youth in America. but it's been the number one cause of death for black youth since 2006. And so, unfortunately, one community of our youth has been intensely impacted for now almost 20 years.
Michael, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the car accident example that Megan mentioned. Car accidents still a big problem, much smaller problem than it once was. I just thought it might be nice to have a case study for how we could approach a big problem like this using public health tools.
Well, I think what's important here is these are long-term issues that you have to work on over a long period of time. Something like this cannot be a project of the month, project of the year. And I've used the automobile issue a number of times to try to get across to people about that change is possible. Things will get better. It's important to have hope. And I recall, many of you may recall, I know some of you in the room definitely do, Ralph Nader way back many, many years ago when we had a horrific problem with automobile accidents, and he decided to talk about seat belts and airbags. And I remember at the time, most people, their views were that this is ridiculous, it won't work, manufacturers won't make them, nobody will buy them, it'll be too expensive, the public won't accept it. Well, you look at where we are today. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very, very important to think this way so that you're positive as you move along. And we've seen a little progress recently, by the way, on gun homicides, which is important. But so you have to look at it over a long period of time. There are other issues like even smoking. You know, you can probably gather I'm Irish, and I grew up in Ireland, and everybody smoked. And if you ever years ago suggested that there would be an attempt to eliminate smoking in public places, people would have hounded you out of the town, out of the village. Today, in a public arenas, you have no smoking at all. So I think you've got to keep in mind the trajectories of those issues to see the possibilities going forward. And as you said at the very beginning, this is, there's politics involved in everything, but you have to look at this as a pure public health issue. And when you look at it as a public health issue and you speak to the public about it and you mention to them, and I've spoken to many, many conservative audiences, and you mention the fact that it's the leading cause of death for kids, cancer is number 3, guns is number 1, you have to appeal to people's sensitivities about the fact that this is not what we should be talking about. This is not what should make us distinctive in the United States, to have a situation where guns are the leading cause of death for kids. This is why it's a public health issue, and this is why, in my view, it is a huge responsibility for healthcare organizations, healthcare provider organizations, to take a leading role in emphasizing the issue, talking about the issue, putting in place the infrastructures to make improvements on the issue. I went public on this in a big way as a healthcare leader about 6-7 years ago. And Megan and I have had numerous discussions on this over the years. We can't just be dealing with the results of gun violence. We've got to be dealing with how you stop it up front. In many ways, it's a social determinant of health issue in a big, big way. And so every healthcare organization, every hospital, every health system, I believe, has to make this a priority. By the way, it resonates big time with employees. Because I believe employees want to belong to something. They want to belong to an organization that attempts to do good for the overall world, not only internal to your organization, but taking positions externally. It takes a little bit of courage, but I think it's more acceptable today than ever before, and we can talk about some of the things that we've done over the last couple of years in a few minutes, but there is hope here over the long haul, and we are making some difference. It is not all bad news right now.
So,
Mike's being very modest, but you are literally one of the largest health leaders to step up and speak out on this first, and so can we please give them a round of applause? Because that's huge. So thank you, seriously.
Well, thanks, Greg. And we held a big meeting in the White House last
Thursday?
A week ago, and Greg spoke, and we had at the MAT meeting, we had that place, we had 80 to 90 people, healthcare leaders from all over the United States. every part of the discipline of health, medical schools, trade association leaders, hospital leaders. It's very different than it was, 7 or 8 years ago, because when I went out public, it was hard to get people to take a position on this. But today we have a national council of CEOs, 60 of them right now, that have actually been part of an overall council to work on this in terms of prevention and safety. Remember, healthcare organizations are the biggest employers in most of the communities that they exist in. They have a major influence, so what you say matters. And if you talk about this, in fact, at the meeting that we held in New York, we hold a national forum on gun violence in New York every year. We had recently a mayor of one of the cities in Texas come and speak.
And so that's actually, when you talk,
Remember that?
yeah, and when you talk about the car crash analogy, I think that the mayor in Texas is a great example. It's this harm reduction framework, the idea that we have seatbelts and changes in the design of cars. We have drunk driving laws, but we also have education that both as a healthcare provider we do, screen for people who are drinking too much, provide counseling, link them to services. We have education that we all receive now around the danger of drinking and driving. We've changed media portrayals of drinking and driving. And we have economic incentives for safe driving as well, whether it's insurance incentives for not getting tickets, for not being in crashes. We have economic incentives as well in you don't want to get a ticket, right? And so it's a combination of different strategies that we use to decrease car crash deaths without demonizing car owners or car drivers. And so we use this public health approach to identify what are the different spaces and places that we can intervene. We also developed trauma systems, which didn't exist back in the 1970s. And so we took this structural or societal approach as well to help change some of the things that had people die from car crashes. All of those are available for gun violence. We can change engineering, we can do education, we can change media portrayals, we can create economic incentives, right? And we can change the structural factors in society that lead someone to pick up a gun and shoot themselves or shoot someone else.
So let's get down to brass tacks a little bit about guns. I feel like we have a sense now of what this frame is, but I would like to get into some specifics. And just to start with the beginning of your process, you want to have research, you want to have knowledge and information and data. And I do think guns are an area where we maybe have less research and less data than we do about other comparable causes of death, in part because the government hasn't been funding it. But that's changing, right? We have government funding now of research, and there's a lot of states and private individuals who have raised a lot of money for research. There are more academics who are entering this field and trying to understand it. So how close are we to really knowing the shape of the problem and knowing what the right interventions might be?
Well, I just want to emphasize this is the least researched cause of death out of the top 30. There's more research around youth sepsis. And I know y'all health people, I didn't know what sepsis was. But there's more research around youth sepsis than there is around youth gun violence. And it's a tragedy how little we know. But even with the little that we do know, we're starting to see real results when we start investing in strategies. And I do think the ceiling is pretty high for what we can accomplish once we start digging in. But it is terrible how far behind we are on this issue. Even if you look at the dollars per death in America, it is embarrassing how little we're pouring into this versus youth cancer and all these other issues.
And from the data side, I mean, we are just scratching the surface. I can tell you who dies. Beyond that, we're using, honestly, there's a nonprofit database called the Gun Violence Archive, which some of you may know of, which is the best source of data that any of us as researchers have about who's getting injured, where, and why. They pull media reports about shootings and load them up into this database that's accessible to folks across the United States. Similarly, for school shootings, it's a nonprofit database, the K-12 school shooting database. That's our best source of data.
So can I interrupt for 1 second just to say, so just to come back to car accidents, every time there's a car accident, there's this massive form that everyone has to fill out, and there's a huge CDC government database that says, what kind of car was it? What was the road condition? What was the weather? Was it at night? Was the driver impaired? For other public health problems, we have the government aggregating all this data so that you can start to understand how these things interact to cause the death.
That's exactly right. And data is only step one, right? We can measure until the cows come home. That doesn't change patterns of injury and death. But if we don't have the data, then how can we know whether what we're doing is working?
We don't even have injury data.
Yeah.
So federally, we don't even know how many people are being injured by firearms, at least from the government side. So it's not that we don't have a lot of data. We barely have any data on this crisis.
And that's one of the issues that we've been focusing on. Our Center for Gun Violence Prevention, which we established 6-7 years ago, and we're working now with a few hundred organizations across the United States, healthcare organizations, where we have monthly conversations with them, but also trying to get everybody to develop a database as to what happens and what are the experiences in each of their places, not just the deaths, but the injuries. The other thing that every healthcare organization should do, and some are doing it, we actually got an NIH grant to do universal screening for all patients that come to our emergency rooms. So when the patient comes to the emergency rooms, you ask them lots of questions about lots of things, healthcare-related issues, but you ask questions now about guns, about the relationship with guns, what happens in the neighborhood with guns, have they been victims of it, or have they known people with victims of it? And we've done tens and tens of thousands of screenings, and we get information from the patients and from the kids who are patients, and then we follow up with those patients when we anticipate that there could possibly be an issue that is about to percolate, so we can intervene. And this is the other issue with healthcare organizations, and many are doing this, is to be involved with the schools in a big way. So we're involved with about 80 high schools right now, and have crisis centers in the schools, but a big part of it is also focusing on gun violence. Remember, one other point I want to make is that we're all, in many ways, victims of the gun violence epidemic, because it's not just what happens to the person over there, but each one of us, whenever we're in a large group, or when our kids are in a large group, or our kids go someplace and they're in a major, you're always back of your mind thinking, what if? What might happen? Are you safe? I mean, this is something, especially over the last decade, that people are beginning to think about, where in the past they never thought about this. So it's fundamental for all of us to take a leadership role in continuing to communicate about the importance of this issue, doing the research. And remember, there was bipartisan legislation on this a few years ago. And remember, it was bipartisan. Where
That's your cue.
You were very involved in this, Greg. That, put a lot of money out there, not as much as anybody would like, but a lot of money given the circumstances, for mental health issues and other issues and intervention issues across the United States. And as a result, there has been a reduction, that we see improvement. That's why you can't be pessimistic and negative about this. It looks bad at the moment, but over time, if everybody coalesces around an issue that is very, very important from a health point of view, you will make fundamental change long term. And the 60 CEOs from around the United States, all of them, and they're from every state, red state, blue state, every state, they've all put their signature in a full-page ad in the New York Times that they're committed to focusing on this issue. Now, 6 years ago, you couldn't get 5 people to sign up. But today, you have 60, and every week we get new people wanting to join. And we hold regular meetings with these CEOs from around the United States, and it makes you feel good about the fact that people are now more and more committed, because we're all seeing the trauma in our facilities all the time. Not just the person who's injured, but the family circumstances, the kids, the mothers, the environment, the people who are around all of them. We see it all the time. We've had over a 350% increase in people coming to our children's hospital in 1 year as a result of gun injuries and gun violence. It's gone down this year. Good news. There's a reduction this year. Last year, it was a huge jump. That's all positive, and therefore I think you have to have hope.
So again, I just want to try to be as specific as we can.
Yeah.
There is a lack of research and there is a need for more information, but there are things that we do know and things that I know that all of you guys would like us to be doing more of. And Greg, obviously you're deeply engaged in trying to figure out where to put government resources now that we have them. Could each of you talk about like maybe 2 or 3 evidence-based strategies that you think have legs?
Only 2 or 3?
Yeah, just just quickly. I just feel like I want everyone to have a sense of like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm like, how do I sort these? Right. Well, I think when we think, let's just start with with youth violence in schools and everything that revolves around youth violence. Frankly, I think the most important thing we can do is push for safe storage because youth are primarily getting their guns from homes. We found that 76% of school shootings, the guns come from the home. 80% of youth suicide, the guns come from the home. And I think there's this kind of, I don't know, I think people think that the guns are coming from some boogeyman in the alley in a van, but in reality, they're coming out of nightstands and closets and under pillows. And so if we can get folks to, parents specifically, to be more responsible about safely storing their guns, understanding the urgency and how important it is, but also holding them accountable when needed. But if we can shift that culture, that'll be huge. But it's starting. So have y'all seen Bad Boys yet? Yeah. Raise your hand if you've seen Bad Boys. Okay, everybody else should be ashamed. Y'all need to go see it. It's great. But do you remember that scene where the home invaders came in and Reggie, what did he do? Where'd he go? Where'd he go straight to?
He went straight to the closet.
Straight to the closet, opened up his safe storage box, got his firearms, protected the family. But that was in Hollywood, a big blockbuster movie. And so I think moments like that are huge because we have to teach people that safely storing your guns doesn't make you more vulnerable to violence. It doesn't make you less safe. If anything, it makes sure that your intention to protect your family doesn't turn around and harm your family.
We did an ad on this. We produced an ad where a family shows up at another family's at the door, and while they're speaking at the front of the door of the family home, you hear the tiger. The roar of a tiger, and so the person who was about to come into the home said, "Is it locked up?" And then, of course, it goes to gun issue. Don't be afraid to ask. I mean, is the gun locked up? Now, we did some research on this, and we've seen a difference.
Yeah.
Where people are actually much more alert about the fact that if there is a gun in the home, it is safely locked up. Because you're absolutely correct. Guns come from the home. Kids pick up the guns. And you had a case recently where a 15-year-old, a 12-year-old shot a 15-year-old by getting a gun from the home, playing with the gun. It went off accidentally, and he killed I think it was his brother, 15-year-old. But these are all preventable things. But you got to be consistent with the message. And if you're consistent, you'll make a change.
I did want to add one more.
Yeah.
She said two. I only got two.
And we want three, by the way.
Yeah. I got
Between the three of us, we can, yeah.
Another big one when we think about homicide reduction is community violence intervention programs. And I'm a big proponent of it because I've seen it work in action. And I've watched how it can be transformative to individuals, how it can intervene conflicts, de-escalate conflicts, but also shift behavior in a major way. And, you know, I think even when you think about homicides in inner cities, especially in the Black community, there's this misconception that it's crime-driven or poverty-driven, but the stats don't really align. You know, only 11% of homicides in the Black community are connected to any type of gang activity. 30% are connected to another felony. So what we're seeing is, you know, over 2/3 of what's happening is interpersonal conflict, things that could be de-escalated, arguing over a girl at a party. I was at the Aspen reception and they cut in front of me when I was trying to get a short rib, right? It's like these types of conflicts, but what we're seeing is individuals that are in crisis. They have other stressors. They have so much going on. And guess what? In that moment of frustration and anger, they have easy access to a firearm. So there's two parts to it. How do we help people navigate through those emotional moments and make sure that moment of crisis doesn't turn into an altercation? And then secondly, how do we create time and space between access to the gun? And so community violence intervention is huge because it helps people navigate through those moments of crisis, recognizing that after the moment, everyone regrets the altercation. But guess what? When there's a gun involved and a shooting involved, 2 lives are destroyed, if not more than that.
Not more, yeah. So those would have been my top 2. So now I'm going to go to I'm going to broaden the aperture a little bit about the types of interventions that have tremendous evidence already. So the first is something that may surprise you, has absolutely nothing to do with the gun itself. It's investing in neighborhoods. There have been a number of randomized studies done by colleagues at Penn and at Columbia and elsewhere showing that when you randomize a neighborhood to either have a garden put into a vacant lot or to leave the vacant lot alone, the neighborhoods where you put a garden in see lower levels of violence, including gun violence, as well as lower levels of stress and depression. So they didn't talk about guns, they didn't talk about conflict at all. Instead, they invested in the neighborhood to change people's ability to come together as community members, to give people a sense of hope, to expose folks to nature, and that has a tremendous salutary effect on gun violence, as well as probably on other factors that influence health as well. So putting gardens in, putting in street lights, remediating abandoned buildings, all make a difference in terms of death rates. And you mentioned yesterday the huge decrease in Detroit's homicide rate is partly due to the reinvestment in Detroit over the last few years with the current mayor. Any of us that have spent time in Michigan know what Detroit was like a decade ago versus when you go now. It's a tremendously different city where they literally razed a bunch of those abandoned buildings and are investing in creating community space instead. So that would be my number one is safe storage, 2 is the violence intervention programs, 3 would be structural change, and recognizing, of course, the effect that historical redlining has had as well on that community violence. We know that there's a very strong relationship between communities that were subject to redlining, right, where blacks were told they could only buy houses in certain communities. If there was a community with strong redlining, we see higher rates of community violence. Oh, go ahead. No,
I was going to say, with that, too, it doesn't mean, like, drop a Whole Foods in there and, like, watch the community change, demographically. I think the only way this works in a way that doesn't just push violence to other communities is if you partner it with a housing strategy, an economic opportunity strategy. So I just want to caution, like, it's not as nice as just, you can't just make the neighborhood prettier, and if the people change, that's not necessarily the approach. That's why I'm really proud of Baltimore, for example. They have a really good two-pronged approach of investing in neighborhoods, but also creating more opportunity for home ownership and for staying and growing and developing. And so I just want to put that caution out there.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up on what Megan said is in Harlem, we work very closely with an organization called Harlem Grown. They have 13 farms. Now, it's absolutely fascinating. They've taken vacant lots and they have hyperbaric farms. And they grow extraordinary amounts of food. The kids in the neighborhood work in those farms. They get job experience. We're working with them. We actually provide them internships and apprenticeships also in the healthcare system. And many of them we've actually hired. And we're expanding. There is a whole new, another expansion of that farm now in Harlem. But these are wonderful local organizations that changes the sense of that neighborhood, that sense of community, and you involve the kids. This is why also working with the high schools is unbelievably important. And by the way, I'm a strong believer that if you work with the high schools, as many people are doing, and many organizations in the room are doing this, and get them connected to the world of work in healthcare, you're not only, because I believe if you take a kid from a poor neighborhood or a distressed family circumstance and you give them the opportunity to get a good education, improving their health, you're also occupying them, doing other things. You create the workforce of the future, and this is why, as part with the Bloomberg Foundation, we're actually creating the Northwell High School of Health Sciences, which will open up next year. Awesome. And people ask me, you're a healthcare organization, you run hospitals, ambulatory sites, medical schools, and everything. What are you doing in the education space? To me, that's health. But it's health that affects also the gun violence issue, because it's multifaceted. There is not one single bullet here. But I do think that every healthcare organization has a mammoth responsibility and obligation here to take a major leadership role locally and nationally on this. And,
a lot of what we've been, I'm interrupting you, I'm sorry. A lot of what we've been talking about so far is focused on homicide and a little bit on accidental deaths. And I think those are the parts of the gun violence problem that tend to get the most attention in the press and in the political conversation. I think mass shootings in particular are, every time one happens, everyone is so shocked, and there is a desire to investigate and understand and try to solve that problem. But suicides are just an absolute absolutely huge part of this problem, and I do want to make sure that we talk about suicide as well. Depending on the year, suicide, somewhere around 2/3 of all gun deaths are suicides. And so how can we use this public health approach to focus on that? And how can we talk about gun suicide more? Because I do think it really fades into the background when we talk about this problem.
Thank you, Margot. And that would have been my second, which is around talking about gun suicide. I appreciate you raising that. It is something that we don't talk about. And I will say part of the reason that I came into this work is because of gun suicides, as is true, I know, for so many in the audience. So the second thing that we can do is to partner with gun owners around talking about suicide, around talking around mental health, around talking about the importance of removing access to a firearm for that period of time that someone is hopeless, impulsive, or desperate. And it's of course about making sure, and this is where safe storage actually plays in, is making sure that folks don't have access to a firearm in a moment of impulsivity, particularly kids. Who, they have a breakup, they have a social media conflict, they think it would be easier to end it, and if they have easy access to a firearm in that moment of desperation, it can lead to tragic consequences.
There's a difference between when they think about doing it to the actual
exactly.
event. It's very short.
Very short.
Yeah.
And if you can, unfortunately, a suicide attempt with a firearm is 90% likely to be lethal, which is why we see so few of them in the emergency department. They almost always die on scene. A suicide attempt with something else, we can almost always save people, and then they go on to lead healthy lives. There's also an element of suicide prevention, which is talking about older adults. You mentioned that we largely see suicide in older white men, as well as middle-aged Alaskan Native or American Indian men. And one thing that we're increasingly looking at is the relationship between a medical diagnosis or a dementia diagnosis and firearm suicide. And so knowing that these moments of receiving a life-altering diagnosis are a point where someone's life can change, having the conversation around firearm access there, and empowering families to have that conversation with their friends and family members. So we're working with gun shops. I'm personally working with 4-H, shooting sports. We're working with coalitions of gun owners to try to change this conversation about mental health and firearms and around suicide prevention, and which is just tremendously powerful and important.
And this is, I just mentioned, the mental health issue. And we have to be careful that not all gun violence is tied to mental health. Because some people on the other side will argue it's all about mental health, but mental health is a big component of it. But this is where there needs to be a massive investment in the commitment to mental health funding. I mean, I know that Mount Sinai is very involved in New York on this. With us, we're big providers of mental health, but you don't get reimbursed to invest in the mental health arena enough. Now, the bipartisan legislation did something here. But the fundamental funding stream for mental health is is very minimalistic. And the need is like this, especially among youths, among kids with the growth in anxiety, depression, and suicide with kids. We actually have a documentary, a 2-hour HBO documentary that just came out called One South. It's showing what we're doing to try to prevent high school and college kids from committing suicide. This just came out this week. But the commitment to the mental health issue here is something that I think government needs to take a much larger leadership role in doing something real about the funding streams for mental health.
Are we going to talk about domestic violence?
Yeah, let's talk about domestic violence. Yeah, I think that's another huge category that's sort of under that homicide umbrella, but maybe doesn't get talked about as much.
Yeah.
Can one of you guys tell us how big a part of the problem is domestic violence?
So domestic violence homicide is the leading cause of homicide death for women, and the majority of those are firearm homicide. Again, thinking about kind of this room, chances are that many of us know someone who's died of firearm suicide. Chances are also high that many of us know someone that's died of domestic violence, firearm homicide. It's tremendously prevalent. And domestic violence is linked to lots of other kinds of gun death as well. It's linked to gun suicide, it's linked to mass shootings, it's linked to homicide, which is why I'm so thrilled that the Supreme Court upheld the current regulations allowing removal of firearms for folks that are under a domestic violence restraining order.
So that's breaking news as of this morning. The Supreme Court is allowing that law.
Yeah. It would have just undermined. Yeah.
It's good to see them do something good.
Big win.
I don't know if you want to weigh in there too. Yeah.
No, I mean it's huge because we know that there's a direct correlation between domestic abuse, access to a firearm, and gun-related death connected to domestic abuse. And if it wasn't for this decision, it would have stripped a lot of tools out of our toolbox. One major thing that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act did was help clarify what it means to be a dating partner, but it also made gun trafficking a federal offense, and it helped us expand licensing of those who are engaged in the business. And this is important because we did a study, a 5-year study on gun trafficking, and found that the #1 source of guns getting into the hands of domestic abusers that are prohibited are guns that are trafficked. So we went back, okay, where are they trafficking from? And they found that they were coming from unlicensed private sellers. So online sellers, gun shows, marketplace exchanges, but folks who are selling multiple guns at a time are the #1 source for guns that are trafficked and ultimately get in the hands of domestic abusers. And so now we're prosecuting gun traffickers because it's now a federal offense for the first time due to this administration. We've actually prosecuted over 500. We have now required 20,000 unlicensed private sellers to become licensed. So that is the #1 source. And now we're able to get to how these guns are getting into the hands of domestic abusers. But if that Supreme Court decision was different this morning, all those tools would be, we would be unable to use those. And we're proud of how we've been able to get to the source to intercept guns before they get into the hands of domestic abusers illegally.
So I do want to talk a little bit before we go to audience questions about the politics of this issue and how to break through some of the political challenges of implementing changes here. We have just had the Supreme Court uphold this law on domestic violence, but that kind of runs counter to what the Supreme Court has been doing, where they really have a very expansive view of gun rights under the Second Amendment. And we did just have a bipartisan piece of legislation in the gun space, but that was pretty hard fought. It doesn't happen very often. Just want to hear, especially from you, Greg, but from everyone, just briefly about how do we break through some of the gridlock? How do we try to get politicians to be a little bit more collaborative and open to making policy change in this space where it's needed?
You know, I don't know if it's gridlocked as people feel, right? Because look, y'all, we have 15 Republicans support the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This is the first bill in 30 years, or 29 years to be exact. And people give our little bill a hard time, but that bill is doing a lot. We expanded background checks for those under 21. We've seen a 25% reduction in under 21 sales, approved sales. We made gun trafficking a federal offense. We are now engaging, those who are engaged in the business must now be licensed. We pushed out $30 billion. We strengthened 988. We added 14,000 school-based mental health professionals, literally made the largest single-time youth investment in youth mental health in American history. We started to fund community violence intervention for the first time. All the dating partner materials, all that's in one bill. This is actually
what did it take, though? How did you guys get it done?
Oh man. Okay,
Ooh,
so
this is a good story.
Yeah. Look, there's a reality that the difference between the failed passage of universal background checks in 2013 and the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the real difference is really the mighty force of the activists and organizers. When that happened in 2013, everyone was afraid of the gun lobby. But in 2022, people were afraid of these activists. They were afraid of volunteers, leaders, Moms Demand Action, survivors that were storming their halls. And we heard from Republicans directly, and they said, look, I want to do something, but I have to support this because I'm getting 7-to-1 calls in support of this. And these are folks in red districts, right? And so, we were in the hall when the Senate voted for this, and I watched Mitch McConnell high-five Mitt Romney after it passed, and I was like, whoa, this is crazy. They wanted to do something. They wanted to take action. And what's also exciting about this bill is not only did you have this big movement that was pushing and fighting for it, you also saw a bill that brought some of the ideas from both sides to the table. And you have folks like Tom Tillis, who is the biggest, huge Republican out of North Carolina, but is the biggest champion of expanding those under 21 background checks. He brags about it. This is his thing. And it's like, wow, when it comes to investing in 988, that's something that Republicans really brought forward. And even things like, when we think about the gridlock, it's interesting because if you look at different parts of the country, it's a whole different story. So in Florida, red flag laws was a Republican effort. You know, they've used it over 12,000 times, and they brag about it. Like, this is how they took action to address violence at the Parkland. But then if you go to Virginia or you go to Arizona, well, we don't want that progressive policy. Like, whoa, in Florida, of all places, this is their thing, you know? In Texas, victims' compensation and rights for victims of gun violence after the Uvalde shooting, that was a Republican-led and championed effort. And so a lot of what we're seeing is polarizing in Congress doesn't quite align with what's happening across the country. I mean, we have members of Congress that are in New Orleans who are, half of their earmarks are going to community violence intervention programs, but then when they come to Washington, they won't vote for it. So it's like, well, I think it's more of a game of politics in Washington about posturing and looking a certain way than it is really connected with their values or their investments, because Republicans and Democrats are supporting different elements of these solutions all over the country, and it's just not it's not black and white like I think it feels.
So
If you focus on the human aspect of this,
Hear, hear.
you know, and I've been in front of groups. When I went out public at the beginning, I mean, I got a lot of negative feedback, and the typical response I got, emails, was like, "Stay in your lane." And I'm thinking, well, this is our lane. What if this is not our lane? What is? But then you meet with those people and you talk about the human aspect of this.
Yeah.
The mother who just lost a kid, the brother who lost a brother, the trauma that we see in the ERs and in the hospitals. And all of a sudden, and you focus on the issue of kids especially, which, by the way, we know that statistic well. But many of the groups out there that don't connect that statistic to this as much as we would like. But when you do it, you get a resounding positive response from people who are strongly supportive of the Second Amendment. And so you don't demonize that. You focus on the human aspect of it. Like you didn't demonize automobiles, you focused on the safety aspect and the public health issue of automobiles. The same thing you did with cigarette smoking and other things. So focus on the human piece, focus on the public health aspect. This is where healthcare providers have an important role, because they know what we do, and we can relate to the human aspect of this more than others can, and we can articulate it better than what others can. And when you do so, you get response. And the dark politics of it, you kind of stay away from.
okay, audience, it's your turn. I want to make sure we have a chance for you to ask questions. There are folks with microphones around the room, so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and someone will come find you with a microphone. Maybe this woman over here in the blue. Hang on, just coming right behind you.
Perfect. Thanks to all the panelists so much. I'm Kathy Kenworthy, glad to be here. One question really around regulatory that I'm interested is specifically the focus on violent video games. I feel like that has been a very parallel trend to this sort of numbing among young people, the gore, the blood, the guns that are part of many of those games. Do you see that as an important factor? Is there any effort that is or could be focused on those issues?
Honestly, we have allowed the gun industry to market in some of the most gruesome ways possible. And I don't think entertainment, music, video games, television, movies, there doesn't seem to be a limit to how far they can go with how they're marketing these different firearms. And, my little cousin can tell you how to customize an assault weapon. He's 9 because of Call of Duty, right? But I think the other side of it is that we have to figure out how do we hone them in and start to think about regulating the marketing. Just last week there was a Barbie-themed assault weapon that was being promoted, right? It literally has Barbie on it. It's pink. It's made for kids, and so it is definitely spiraling. So it's definitely important, but I do think because of PLACA, the immunity that the gun industry has does not incentivize them building or marketing in a safe and responsible way. They're just building and marketing in a way that produces more profit, and until we break past that, I think we're going to continue to see some of these very egregious marketing approaches. And just briefly, PLACA's legislation that protects gun makers from liability from product-related claims, right? Okay. Yeah. All right. Here in the front.
Sorry, I'm making you jog all over.
Getting your steps in.
Thank you for the panel. Very informative. You know, a few years ago, we had Congress finally lift, after such a long time, the ban on research for CDC on firearm violence prevention, and that was, you know, seen as such a game changer for in the public health community. And I'm curious what you think the next thing of that magnitude could be that you would like to see.
Sure. So I'll say a couple things. And just to be clear, so the Dickey Amendment, which was passed in 1996, never actually banned us doing firearm injury prevention research, but it effectively defunded the CDC and then did the same thing to NIH. As a result, the number of us doing this work dried up to kind of 2 hands worth of researchers working on this across the country. We've slowly rebuilt that over the last decade, and thanks in part to the This Is Our Lane campaign, did get funding reinstated under the Trump administration, under Secretary Azar, for the first time in 24 years. Since then, we've had $25 million appropriated, split between the NIH and CDC, but we just published a study showing that the amount of research being done far outstrips the amount that the federal government is spending on it, because it inspires people to think that this is an area there where we can have hope. And as Margot mentioned, there's a lot of philanthropists that are getting in the game as well, whether working with universities, working with healthcare systems, which has made a huge difference. So there are 2 game changers that I would love to see next for our work on firearm injury prevention research. So funding, number 1. Number 2 is, actually, I would love to see a Surgeon General's report on firearm violence to talk about this in the same way that we talk around other major drivers of health problems. And then I'm going to add a number 3, which is seeing us all collaborate with communities that are affected and having structures and systems that allow us to do that. I think that's on us as healthcare systems and academic institutions. I also think it's on the way that the funding is constructed, and kudos to the White House, to the NIH and CDC for starting to create those structures that make sure that we partner with the affected communities, whether it's rural gun owners or urban gun owners, talking about survivorship, making sure that the work that we're doing resonates and is able to be implemented.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so make it really good. Okay, this hand is very high, so just wait for your microphone.
Hello, everybody. My name is Leonora Lightwalker. I am the CEO and founder of Free Texas, which stands for Finished Recidivism Through Education, Employment, and Divinity. I am also justice impacted, formerly incarcerated. We don't like the word ex-con or ex-felon because, as you speak, they're very demonizing words in our community. One thing I started doing was hiring our formerly incarcerated to come and take classes. And each individualized class is more in tune with the mental health aspect of it. Because what I'm seeing is a lot of people are talking around the needs of safety of gun violence, but knowing that our children are generationally affected by the incarceration system. So we have family members like myself and others that are coming out of incarceration that cannot even get the minimum needs met of housing, education. And then when we do get, first time for me ever getting mental health assistance was when I was incarcerated. But when I came out, that was quickly taken away from me. So I'm just trying to get an understanding, because we need to look at root issues, the generational factor that we have here, the domestic violence that happens towards men as well, that come out of incarceration, move in with women that know that they are on probation or parole, or women that know they're on probation or parole, so they will not reach out. Because as soon as we do reach out, we go back into jail because we have a background on a blemish on us. And then our children are affected. Everything has been siloed and systematically put in place where we are not able to reconnect with our children. Women that have children that are incarcerated, when we come out, our kids are given in foster care or they're adopted out while we're still incarcerated. So I really would like us justice impacted people to start being more a part of the conversation when we're asking, hey, how do you fix these things? How do you help these things? When we're starting to look at what the rooted issue is, we know even in San Antonio, Texas, at Corazon Ministries that does harm reduction, 90% of those people are justice impacted people. I just want to know, what do you think that can be done to really put justice impacted people become citizens first and foremost, and also give us ample health care and insurance when we come out, at least 3 to 5 years, because we're sexually abused, we're mentally abused, and we're physically abused when we're incarcerated, and then we come out and we're told, hey, go get a job. Thank you.
So I think, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I appreciate this attention to the challenges for people who have been incarcerated and how they can be wrapped into our programs, and I hope we can talk about it more offline. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for all of their insight and all of their work in this area. Thank you so much to all of you for your really great questions and attention and getting up early to come talk with us about this. Take care.
Thank you.